Are we on? Okay. So agenda item number 15 is something that we've been talking about for a time, and again, it does not spring from the mind of Natalia or the mind of Paul. The regulated community frequently asks us to talk about fact-finding trips. How do we define fact-finding trips? How should they think through that? And so we have done a survey of other states. As you've seen in the materials, we've looked at how the feds handle it. It's all very interesting, and people look at this stuff in different ways. There's a little bit of a dilemma about what to go the way to go forward, because when you look at the statute itself, and again, I'll read it, necessary expenditures. Again, a lobbyist is permitted to fund necessary expenditures for transportation and lodging when the purpose of the travel is to explore matters directly related to the duties of a member of the legislative branch, such as fact-finding trips, including attendance, blah, blah, blah. So fact-finding trips are listed as an example. You know, they are not a all-encompassing category unto themselves. They are an example of the type of thing a lobbyist could fund a member of the legislature. So what we're doing is we're elucidating an example rather than populating a category, and so it's a little harder, and I would ask for comments from other commissioners, comments from staff, comments from the regulated public, because the whole idea, I think, is to say that, all right, if they're fact-finding trips, there ought to be somebody somewhere, whether it's the lobbyist or the legislator, who tells somebody what facts were discovered. If it's fact-finding, great, there were facts involved. What are they? So what's the reporting format there? You know, is it, the lobbyist can't really say what the legislature did or didn't learn. Where would the legislator report that? And then the other is, the other reason I think we brought this forward is you don't need to travel as much as you once did. You know, we have obviously teleconferencing, you have videos, you have, you know, various experiential learning tools such that if you need to go see the power plant beside Pebble Beach Golf Course, you can probably go see the power plant without leaving your office, given the means of electronic education today. So I'll just open it up for discussion. How do people want to proceed here?
Mr. Chairman, it certainly would be worthwhile to lay out facts about fact-finding. However, we're so used to reacting to stimuli, that is, a request for an opinion or a complaint of some sort. I suppose there's nothing wrong with being able to do this under the general aegis by which we make recommendations to the biennial sessions of the Texas legislature. That is, if we consider this an issue that requires legislation, we could look at it in that context and make recommendations.
We could, and those get ignored. But we are responding to stimuli. Make no mistake about it. The lobby community has come to me and said, why don't y'all spend some time with fact-finding trips, because that's where we think a lot of the abuses occur. So again, in that sense, I'm responding to stimuli, not a formal AOR or not a rulemaking request or not a lawsuit, but a statement from a credible representative of the regulated community that there's abuse in this category, and we ought to think about making it clearer what fact-finding is.
Well, I would hesitate to suggest a committee because that's a good way to be recruited.
No, I mean, this is my problem, and so I'm not going to point. I'm just a little bit at odds with how to proceed, other than.
I think it's very valid to look into it, and
let me do this. Let me direct staff to create some examples of how facts that were learned on this voyage were otherwise reported after the fact. And if necessary, they can work with the presiding officers or the administrative committees of both houses to figure out, you know, how somebody tells what they learned. If this was a fact-finding trip, what facts did you find? And then some statement whereby people have to have considered other means beyond physical travel to acquire these facts. So if staff would just sort of suggest, all right, what's the best way to make sure that the definition of fact-finding trips is not abused, but not to just publish a phone book full of regulations, which is what the feds would otherwise do. Is that clear enough, Ian?
And I might suggest getting at something you mentioned with regard to the proverbial and maybe really existing power plant next to Pebble Beach Golf Course is addressing the question of subterfuge. That is something that is in fact a golfing, fishing, hunting trip with a visit to a state school tacked on in order to make it appear to be a fact-finding trip.
I've been to that power plant, by the way. It's not hypothetical, but I'm a terrible golfer, so.
Mr. Chairman, was there a request of this commission for this information?
Yes.
By you or somebody?
It was a request to me from a responsible member of the lobbyist community.
Yellow one?
Perhaps.
If it to determine whether it's fact-finding, suppose it's a state or national convention that deals with a subject matter in which you deal, like, for example, when I chaired higher education to go to the national conference of state legislatures to attend committee meetings that dealt with education, with the idea in mind that you're exchanging ideas and getting information on what other states are doing, not specifically fact-finding in terms of you're going with a specific issue and you're coming back to report a specific topic, but it is related to the legislative process. And I will admit readily that I've seen members go to national conventions and never go to the convention center, but still they're registered.
You don't mean it.
They kind of attend. How would you determine whether or not somebody actually attended a meeting or attended, if they were at the conference, but whether or not they were involved specifically in the purpose for which they went? How would you even determine that?
Well, the House Administration Committee and the Senate Administration Committee, customarily, they fund NCSL trips. You know, that was been my experience. So if you've got
Yes.
state public dollars funding you, that's not
exactly right. That's
what
not
we're
what
talking
you're
about.
talking about.
Yeah,
Okay.
the legislative bodies have to police themselves. This is when a lobbyist pays for it. In other words, you've got a private subsidy of the travel of a public official. So somebody wants somebody to learn something.
But it happens to be in a location where you can either add to what you look for or substitute what you're going to see for what you were supposed to go for.
Right. This is fertile ground for mischief, is the way Governor Bullock would have said it. So, you know, this is fertile ground for mischief, so we need to spend a little time talking about how we define what's not mischief. So, again, I think all the things that you're saying are exactly right. But Ian, help us, you know, create a best practice for how you establish what's a fact-finding trip. Who reports it, a lobbyist or the legislator?
Well, Mr. Chairman, a lobbyist could give a candidate the money to go and correctly report it, and the candidate or the representative correctly report it. It'd be the same thing.
Is that right? I don't think so.
Well, I mean, if it's a lobby expenditure, then it's the lobbyist who has to report it. And the legislator, the person who goes on the trip, does not have to report it if it's just a lobby expenditure.
Now, if it's a political contribution, let's say this trip is an activity in connection with the office, and a lobbyist makes a political contribution to the legislator, nothing would prohibit the legislator from using political contributions for office holder purposes,
That's what I said.
if it's a political contribution. So,
It's money, whether it's political contributions or buying the airplane ticket.
No, I take your point. You could give cash as a political contribution and somebody can call it an office holder expense.
But if a lobbyist wanted to take 5 people to China who were interested in agriculture, but they could do it two ways. They could either buy the tickets, or they could give the person the money to go to Cuba or wherever.
They could. One interesting distinction between the feds and us is we say the lobbyist has to be present. They say the lobbyist can't be present. So I just thought that was interesting.
I bet most representatives and senators in the state of Texas would, maybe not advise us, but would tell us either privately or publicly or however they wanted to, that they like it the way it is.
Oh, I'm sure they do.
So just for clarification, Chair, so you want some examples of scenarios in which there might be, a certain type of fact-finding trip would be okay, and then other situations where it would be problematic or...
No, scenarios are
pleasure trip?
fact-specific. I'd rather say these are best practices. You need to
Okay.
say these are the facts that we intended to learn, and here's the reason electronic communication couldn't have done the trick.
I see, okay.
Get the same information without leaving, without knowing.
Right, just some external accountability, either on behalf of the lobbyist who's paying for the trip or the legislator who received the trip, to sort of say, okay, we had to travel to find these facts, and these are the facts we found. Something that would just tighten up the process rather than just wave your arms and say, we were fact-finding. I'm on the Agriculture Committee. They've got hogs in Iowa.
Would you exempt from that the committees that were funded or the trips that were funded by the Legislative Council or some group like that? That wouldn't be in this category at all?
Right. This is just the lobbyist-funded
Okay.
travel. That's all. All right. Number 15 was for discussion only. There's no vote. Moving to number 16.